Welcome to the Magdalene Voices, giving voice to those silenced for centuries through sacred conversations with beautiful, illuminating souls. I am your host, Mariaestela, and today I am joined by Suzanne Anderson. Suzanne Anderson is a multilingual leadership consultant, psychologist, author, executive coach, speaker, and transformational facilitator who has dedicated the past 15 years of her 30-year career to decoding an embodied, integral, and accelerated pathway to unlock women's innate potential through her university certificate leadership programs. Suzanne is the co-author of the triple award-winning book, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, Upgrading How You Live, Love, and Lead. Originally from Canada, Suzanne now lives in Seattle, Washington. In this episode, Suzanne and I explore the rise of the divine feminine and how she and her co-author actually sees this rise as an evolutionary necessity. You will also learn about Suzanne's own personal awakening and journey with the divine feminine. I hope you will enjoy this episode, and I want to remind you that there is no greater teacher and no greater truth than the one you carry within. So whenever you are listening or watching to the Magdalene Voices, know that it is meant to be in a well of wisdom, of knowledge, of experiences, and you alone choose whatever you will drink from it. So, Suzanne, a very, very warm welcome to the Magdalene Voices, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. I'm very excited because I read your book, The Mysterial Woman, last year, and it was really a huge eye-opener for me. And so I'm thrilled to be able to honor and have your voice be heard here on the Magdalene Voices. My very first question is going to be about how you felt or saw or sensed these feminine and masculine energies arise, I suppose, within yourself or within your client's community, or how you saw it. How did that come about? How did you realize that that was what was going on?
Right. Well, I'm going to come up with a short story for this because, of course, it's been a thread in my life for quite a while. But let's see. I will say that I probably 17 years ago or so now, I was at the peak of my management consulting career. I was based in Paris, running our Europe, Middle East, and Africa firm with Canadians from Toronto. And it was a very dynamic time of doing transformational leadership in various multinational corporations. I'd had by that time a very long-term spiritual practice that had been in different meditation schools and in community. And so that was a very deep part of me. I was already, I would say, bridging between these worlds of the mainstream of being in the world and yet having a kind of more hidden spiritual practice, I'd say, but bringing those values into my consulting. And certainly bringing my presence into consulting in that way. But I was, and I was at I would say, on the leading edge of leadership development at that time. This was the mid-90s, and which was about bringing in more feminine ways of leading because the old patriarchal model of leadership wasn't working anymore. But so that was going on, and I was sort of I was really seeing that women, the few women that were at the senior levels I was working at in organizations, were suffering enormously. They seemed to be the most challenged to make the changes I was actually there to help them make. In other words, and it was a shock to me. Now I'm less naive about it, of course, but at the time it was I sort of thought women would be glad to see a woman consultant, which was quite rare at that time. Coming to help them, have their voice and collaborate more and connect and share power. And actually, they were more entrenched in the masculine model of leadership. Yeah. So I was seeing women suffering. I was seeing that they were, in a sense, wanting to not suffer, wanting to embrace these more feminine ways of leading and having a really hard time doing that. So that was one side. kind of created a dilemma. I thought, wow, so what are we going to do about that? How do I help them? At the same time, I went to Indonesia, to Bali, actually, to visit my sister who was living in Java. And we spent a couple of weeks on a cleansing fast and meditating and all of this.
Yes.
And at the end of that time, after about 10 days, I was in a meditation, and I actually went into a state, is the best way I can explain it, of opening myself to what at the time I thought was just sort of letting light come into me in a meditative way. But it ended up being a kind of download of energy that lasted for a couple of days, where I was in the stream of what later I came to know as the energy of Kuan Yin, who was a more feminine, goddess, basically a particular energy, the divine feminine.
Yeah.
But this, at the time, all I knew was I was just being flooded with this loving yin nectar, and all sense of my self disappeared, my personality disappeared, even my name, my identity, let's say, was it's even hard to describe what it was, because there wasn't even a self witnessing this. In a way. It was just an experience of being filled with this beautiful nectar. And somewhere in that time, I was asked, in essence, or the question came into me, would I help to midwife the divine feminine on earth? And every cell in my body said, there was no real, it's because of free will here. It's appropriate to be asked, but actually there wasn't an answer. There was, of course, nothing but yes for me. That wasn't even a decision to be made. It was like, of course. And when I came out of this state, this non-dual state, and started to gather together myself again. Who am I and what am I doing here? Then I was in the question, like, what did I just say yes to? And what does it even mean? Because while I was in a spiritual practice, and I had been for a long time, they were more masculine practices, I would say. Yes. With a masculine leader, all of which were actually, I would say, useful in terms of my own spiritual unfolding. Yes. But it wasn't that I had a lot of experience with the divine feminine. I really didn't know what that meant. And so I knew I had said yes within, and I was definitely changed. It was a point in my life where one probability path ended and another opened. Yes. I went back to Paris, and within a very short period of time, I left the firm that I was a part of. I knew that work, I couldn't work inside of that context, doing whatever this was I had said I was going to do. Yeah. And I opened a private practice in Paris, working with women, and it filled up in a minute, because there were so many women, I think, in crisis at that time, who'd kind of gone as far as they could go in the masculine model. Yeah. And seeking to open up new capacity. But I felt like I was 1 nanosecond ahead of my clients. Yeah. Literally, and like 1 session ahead of my clients. So at the end of that year, I realized, okay, there is something that needs to be figured out here about what does it mean for women to awaken to their wholeness, and that took me back to graduate school to study women's development, and sort of that's how the path began. Yes. That's the sort of short version, believe it or not, of the story.
Beautiful story. I think I'm grateful for you sharing it. I'm sure it will resonate with a lot of the listeners or the viewers. One question that pops into my head is because I don't think we lived in Paris at the same time, but almost at the same time. I lived in Paris between 97 and 99, and I'm just curious to know if you think or have an idea of because French people and Paris in particular is it's ancient, it's history, I'm wondering if there is do you see a correlation between the success you had and actually being in France? I'm sure that it would be a success everywhere because there was such a need for it, even at that time, and most certainly now. But is there anything? Have you ever thought, why Paris? What happened?
Yes. Yeah, it's a great question, and I wonder what it was like for you there too, because it's called the City of Light, and I actually, while I lived there, I spent some time, sort of, I would say, studying the sacred roots of Paris, and I feel quite sure that it was specific. The whole awakening for me, Bali for sure, where I think the veil is very thin between the realms, especially relative to the feminine.
Yes.
And Paris, similarly, there's some energy there.
Yes.
That I think was a part. I think I needed to be there without question. For me, even what I access when I speak French, what I access when I'm in my French
Yes.
self, is already more of the feminine. My voice actually changes, as you probably find as well. It's interesting because after that happened and I left, that year that I was there, I did a course. I taught a course based on Clarissa Pinkola Estes' book called Women Who Run with the Wolves.
Mm-hmm.
I did a French friend, and we did it on Ile Saint-Louis.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons we did it there, she had a contact there, but Ile Saint-Louis was originally, apparently, a sacred isle in some traditions
Mm-hmm.
for the feminine, where it was sort of like where the women would go to learn the sacred arts.
Yes.
Whether that's actually true, I don't know, but I know there was absolutely an energy there.
Yes.
And
that's also where, if I'm not mistaken, that's where Notre Dame is placed.
Notre Dame is right. Ile Saint Louis is right beside Ile Cité, so it's it's right beside it.
Yes.
Right next door, basically, energetically. Yeah.
Yes. And that's what we find. I think that's what we find throughout Europe, and I don't know about the world, but I know at least throughout Europe that a lot of the sacred sites of, ancient sacred sites is where we today find a lot of churches and having been built for very good reason. Very interesting. I just wanted to see if there was, and I can hear that you have, and I don't want to go into that now because that can evolve into a whole conversation as well. But I totally feel you with the changing of the voice and the spirit, and there's a different sense of being, and they have a way of being. Even I find they have a way of being in their feminine. Even the men have a way of being in their feminine without becoming women, because it's not, feminine and masculine are different from women and men, and even different genders. So, but I want to dive into one of the questions that I've been dying to ask you, and that has to do with this reemergence. You could call it, of the divine feminine or the feminine energies or essences. Is something you actually call an evolutionary necessity.
Right.
And I remember reading this in your book, and I was like, that really touched me, thinking an evolutionary necessity. So would you please, explain or tell us more why or what is this necessity or evolutionary necessity about?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I suppose where I situate myself in the work and my book, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, which, by the way, is the way of the Mysterial Woman. And that's a distinction, because it's not the Mysterial Woman. It is actually a way of being. It's a way of being that is unfolding, that's not definitive. And the subtitle is Upgrading How You Live, Love, and Lead. So it actually is all ways that we have of being in all domains of our experience. And the way that I understand evolution is that Einstein actually always said this famous quote that we all know, which is, you can't solve the problems of today by the consciousness that created them yesterday, right? So, but that's actually a developmental way of looking. It's saying, in order to have the complexity of consciousness to address the issues of today, we actually need to develop again. We need to turn on the developmental tap and grow the complexity of consciousness. Now, one thing that we know is that, and my co-author in our book, her PhD was in evolution. It was basically as a futurist, so she was tracking the cultural waves. And what we know is that there have been 6 big cultural waves that have moved in since the beginning of the human species, basically. But these waves, every time a new wave comes in, it comes in as a result of the conditions that are created by the consciousness that's around at that time, the conditions exceeding the capacity. And so all of a sudden, we have to grow. Now, that's the same thing when we're just individuals. This is how development works.
Yes.
We crawl. We're little babies. We crawl. If everything goes well, the body creates the infrastructure that allows us, when the impulse arises, now I say, I want that thing over there. Well, I don't want to crawl over there. So all of a sudden, and my body's okay. I actually want to stand up. Like I actually need a more complex consciousness and capacity to go get that thing. I can see there's a thing over there I want to get, and I go and get it. So culture's done the same thing, and it's done this in 6 big waves. We're just in the 7th wave now. Yeah. And one of the things that we can see, and this is pretty much shared by historians and futurists alike, is that whenever there is a new wave coming in, it's always a time of turbulence and disruption. And we're certainly in one of those times right now. We can see that at many levels. Yeah. And what I would say is that the wave that's coming in it's sometimes called a more integral wave, but it actually is we actually require what I would call feminine capacities now in men and in women. Yeah. Because the worldview and the paradigm of the masculine that has been dominant for 5,000 years, we know that. 5,000 years, it's been a particular way of seeing the world through this masculine worldview, and it produced many things. We created many things. We moved evolution forward, you could say. Yes. But that worldview now, we can call it hypermasculine even, is inadequate. It's simply inadequate to address the complexities that we have created with that consciousness. So that's, we could say this feminine impulse is arising now because it needs to arise. Yes. You can call it a divine feminine impulse. And in the work that I do, I'm often kind of wise, I would say, in the language that I use, because I'm translating into the world. Yes. Where that idea can be taken into a religious paradigm or a fundamentalist paradigm. But however you look at it, that there is an arising of this deep feminine impulse, in my view, yeah, to be married with the masculine. So it's not enough just the feminine, because actually we've got to get, that's where I think that our book's making a contribution, because what we discovered when we started working with women in our university programs over years, over 15 years in our research, we began to see, well, it's true that the sort of weaker sister of this feminine masculine yin yang paradigm needs to be cultivated. Yeah. But the feminine arises in relationship to a masculine. Like every feminine impulse arises in a polarity with the masculine, and that the masculine has to be made healthy at the same time. Yes. So that's I would say the evolutionary imperative right now is true for men and women, but my own research has been with women in the last 15 years, is that women really cultivate their own deep feminine nature and bring the healthy masculine, yes, online. Yes. And then, for the sake of something that actually arises, that I'm calling mysterial, because there was no word to describe this, when these yin and yang essences come together, yeah, that we haven't seen before. And that's why the word mysterial is actually this hybrid you can read about in my book, the words mystery and medial that came together. But, of course I there wasn't a word to describe this almost new species of woman I was starting to see, yeah, yes, arise, because she's never been here before. We've never needed these capacities before. It's literally a new genetic code, yes, that's being activated.
And one we wouldn't be able to have, I suppose, without these 5,000 years of masculine, or that masculine wave,
Yeah.
as we call it, that has now turned into the hyper masculine. That's the hyper masculine is what I call the shadow masculine. It's where he go, well, not he, because again, it's not really gender oriented. It's both men and women who, or whatever gender you identify with, you have these. And I agree. For me, I agree with, especially where are bringing your work to, because I know you're bringing your work into, executives and high level businesses and companies, and I do see that, it's a necessity for me personally. I know I mentioned this to you before we went on the call. I used to be a very successful key account manager in a large acquiring company. I was all over Europe. I was all over Scandinavia. I was traveling. I was negotiating contracts. I was doing all of those, masculine and, I suppose also feminine things. But with what I felt was I was using, or what I now know was I was using my shadow, or what I would call my hyper feminine. You probably would call your hyper feminine qualities. And so I'm sure that this, had you written your book before, or had I found it sooner, then my life would, in that period of my life would have been different. But I see it as a strong need. I know that you have an online course coming out in September. I think it's the first one, right? You have coming out.
Third one.
It's the third one. Okay, so it's the third one, and it's I want to make this. It's the Mysterial Leadership Essentials. Would you talk to me a little bit about who is that for? Because who is the woman that you're trying to reach with this? And I completely understand that, because for me, divine is. I can see why some would, be deterred by it, because I would have been 7 years ago. Today it's different, but I understand where someone who would be led to this is at, and I honor her, because I know that her journey is her own, basically. But would you speak, I know it's a 12-week course, but would you speak to a little bit about who are you serving through that course, and what's in, what are the essentials, without, of course, giving your whole clothes away, but yeah.
Well, first I would just say, because I'm speaking to you, and because of the territory you've claimed as your, let's say, or the territory you are stewarding of the Magdalene voices, I told the story, and I will probably tell the story, and it is actually in the book. I do reference it, the story of this awakening with the divine feminine. I mean, the initial impulse for me was, the question was not, will you just bring the feminine impulse into the world? It was, will you help to midwife the divine feminine? Yeah. So that lives deeply in me. That is, ultimately, that's a very deep part of my own lived experience.
Yeah.
And then I have to discern how do I translate that? So I just say both are true. I'm not dialing down the divine feminine, because there is something absolutely that's coming in now that has to do with that quality of energy. But
and I want to say, those who are called, sorry for interrupting, but those who are called, they, like you like, it's they're, the call comes from within. Like, people who will be drawn or pulled, whatever way they want to go, they're going to be, pulled kicking and screaming, or they're going to be, walk the path, but they're going to be, there's an urge or a calling, I would say, for this. So
there is, and there's an urgent calling for people finding me, actually, because it's the same thing. I would say, this introductory course is really, I would say, what women have in common, or and I would even say I would look for in women, is that they are ripening out of the old paradigm. There's a certain phase at which women are still embedded in that paradigm. They'll call them masculine paradigm, and they probably won't be called to what I'm inviting them into. No. But what my research is, what we've decoded, is what I call a sort of source code for awakening this innate potential. I believe over time it will come about anyway. That's evolution. Yes. So the question is, who of us will be at the edge of evolution? Who of us will be the ones actually bringing this in now? And my work is really designed to accelerate that unfolding.
Yes.
Because if you know the code and you start to activate it, it simply accelerates the developmental movement that's already happening. So I would say women would be feeling, you'd know if you were being drawn to my work, because you'd be feeling, first of all, this longing for a new way of being. Yeah. And you can see it a little bit, you can imagine it, you can't live it yet. You know the way you are living isn't correct, so there's also the suffering. There's the suffering of pressing up against the old conditioned ways of being. Mm-hmm. There is the feeling soul dead, having worked so hard to get where you got in your career and in your life even. Got the kids, I've got the partner, I've got the home, I've got all of this, and then it's sort of like, well, now what? Yes. Like something that's not satisfied inside. And often women come in, they're exhausted, they're burned out, they've basically gone as far as they can go inside that hypermasculine paradigm and cannot see another way. I've had women, one thing that's very thrilling for me about the book, and like you were saying, for you to be able to read it, one of the reasons I wrote it was so that women could read it and recognize themselves. Yes. Without ever having to meet me. I couldn't speak to that many people, but I want women to see themselves and this pressure right now inside that paradigm. Yeah. Because in the absence of that, what's actually happening is when this impulse, I'm going to call it mysterial, this like new species of woman, starts to it's getting activated, being pulled forth by evolution itself. Women don't know what to do with it either. They tend to either think, oh my God, it's an impulse that's very enlivening. It's like, I want to go back to who I was before I got into the corporate life, or before I became such a worker bee, or before I got married, or before I bought a house. I want to be free again, a sense that they have to go back somewhere. So then they can break out of all of those structures in ways that are actually not that maybe ultimately they wouldn't leave them, but they wouldn't leave them in the same way. They wouldn't leave them and burn the whole house down. They would recognize the impulse as a move forward. And so that's one. The other thing that women do, and we have this in the United States, an amazing increase in the antidepressants. It's up by 40%, some crazy number of women that are on anti-anxiety meds and antidepressant meds. Why? Because women have to dial down the energy that's naturally arising, and numb it out. So in either situation, we are not making the evolutionary move. We're still reacting to the old paradigm, or being terrified about changing things and what would actually happen.
Yes, and I mean, as you mentioned, I've burned a shit ton of bridges over the past 7 years, and again, that would have been done different. I'm wondering why do you think it is that it's women that are being called? Because we can talk about feminine and masculine, and those energies needing to be balanced and so forth. But it seems as though, because I understand that there is a rise, and that's actually another conversation I'm going to have with someone, is about the need for the rise of the divine masculine, or the men as well. But why do you think that the impulse is so strong, the mysterial impulse, as you call it, is so strong in women?
Right. Well, and it's part of my response here is going to say why it is I'm choosing to focus still on women, because my work in the corporate world was more men. And I get a lot of men now who've read my book, or who would say this is relevant to women as well. To men as well. We need to be doing this. We need to be embracing these feminine, masculine. But one of the reasons I'm working just with women right now is I feel that the capacities is like the absent capacities are the feminine. Mm-hmm. They actually these need to come in men and women, and so women who most, let's say, beings who identify with the gender, who are feminine, identify as feminine women,
Yeah.
That this ground of being is already the deep feminine ground of being. This we know, and this is what I wrote about in the book. We know this from a developmental perspective. What actually happens for young girls, it is not the same as what happens for young boys. That we are when we are born, and then in those early developmental years, we see ourselves as same as mother. We don't start differentiating until later. And so this, in the best case scenario, this is the deep well of being, like we really rest into this great feminine well of being. That's essential for men and women right now to cultivate. But if women can't cultivate this, in my view, we are done. We are done. I mean, there's a way that women right now, and feminine identifying beings have a particular job to welcome the feminine impulse that's coming in and let it marry with the masculine and get this masculine healthy, which is mostly in shadow. In some cases, it's a balance. Usually it's a balance of we've got some healthy masculine, but some of it's in shadow.
Yes.
And so, I think women have a particular role to play. One of the reasons my co-author came into the work with me initially, when she was doing her PhD, she found out that when she looked at what were the positive factors, basically, that allowed any culture in transition to turn toward the positive,
Yes.
To open into something more positive, it had to do with, and in this case, in this time, the scenarios all had to do with the feminine. They all had to do with those people or leaders who were able to bring in the caring and connection and receptivity and listening and sharing power. And those were like, she could see as a futurist, those were all the scenarios for the future for us as a species that were positive. So it was like, wow, all right, then we have a focus here. Yes. Where can we get the most leverage right now for the awakening of consciousness on Earth? Yeah. And it seems to me that women have a particular role to play in that.
Absolutely. I'm like, completely agree. Yeah. What would you say to those who would say, because what would you say to those who are maybe not hearing, what we're trying to say, that it actually is a balance between the two, but that there is a required work to be done on the divine, or sorry, on the feminine essential or energy. What would you say to those that really don't hear our call for balance?
Well, what do you mean?
So often, or maybe it's just me, but very often I see that there's a call, a feminist approach where it seems as though people are hell-bent on creating a matriarchy rather, and the way I see it is that this rise is not for us to create a matriarchy. Going from a patriarchy to a matriarchy is not the way. What we're wanting to do is create, I heard I think it was Danielle Laporte who said it was a fraternité, as a fraternity, a brother and sisterhood of humans, or of souls being in human flesh, and so I guess that's just I don't know even if that was a question, but what comes up for you as I say that, if anything?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think, as you said before, everybody's called in a different way, so, but I am 100% in agreement that I'm not interested in going back. We had 50,000 years of a matriarchy. We know that. 50,000 years when the mother archetype and the dominant orienting around the earth got, all of that was in focus. That was our evolution. Then we had 5,000 years, not 50, 5,000 years of a masculine paradigm. I'm not interested in going back, but there is a thread we need to pull forward of the deep feminine values that got lost in that transition. And to me, it's harder because it requires then harder than just saying, forget what we've got now, reject what we have now, let's go back. What's harder, I think, is to say, this paradigm has moved us forward. It actually has. This is my view, as you said before as well. And now the patriarchy is dying. And it's like, if your father is dying, do you just kick him out on the, street? Or do you also wisely tend to that dying father? Because I think of this, the evolution's move is always transcend and include. Mm-hmm. So we are moving somewhere, but we are taking with us the best that actually arose, during that time. And the invitation, I think, to women that are orienting in reverse is to say, yeah, well, I think there's something waiting for us that we have never seen before. It's not about going back, and that mystery is worth waiting for, and actually worth helping to midwife.
Yes, we are the mothers.
Right.
I think this is going to conclude our sacred conversation. I think that's your point there was so beautiful, that I think that's where we're going to leave. Suzanne, I want to thank you immensely for having taken the time to be with me today in sacred conversation. And for those of you who are listening or watching, or especially for those who are actually listening on the podcast, just know that there's going to be links linking to everything, so you can find that on my website. Yeah, that's it. Do you have anything finally, or as we come to an end, that you want to share or say?
I think the thing I want to say is that as we end is something that, where do you start with all of this if this is igniting something in you and you're listening? And what I would say is, it starts actually, what I would invite you to do, it starts more or less in the embrace of this, the mother, which is the first gate in this source code of 5 different gates that we discovered. And here, what I would say to you is what Thich Nhat Hanh actually said, a Buddhist teacher in France. He says, go back and take care of yourself. Your body needs you. Your feelings need you. Your perceptions need you. Your suffering needs you to acknowledge it. Go home and be there for all these things. Well, that's a good place to start.
Thank you. Go home and be there. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Suzanne.
You're welcome. Thank you. Namaste.
That is what I had for you in today's episode of the Magdalene Voices. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed creating it for you. If you would like to learn more about the Magdalene Voices and today's guest, you can check out my website, Mariaestela.com, where you will find all the deeds and the details.